Well, welcome everyone. I think we'll start and let other people file in as they arrive on this Friday morning or afternoon or early evening, depending where you are. I am B. Ruby Rich. I'm the editor of Film Quarterly, and it's my great pleasure to be welcoming here today both Rashna Richards, who has written this wonderful book, Cinematic TV, Serial Drama Goes to the Movies, and Bruno Guaraná, our page views editor, who selected it for this issue and is joining Rashna in conversation. Welcome to actually the first anniversary, the 1 year anniversary of the page views webinars, as Bruno just reminded me. We went live with these conversations when we all went into lockdown, and it was a print feature long before that, but we decided it would be fun to have these kind of book group convenings 4 times a year, along with the print issues. So here we are. Bruno's joining us now from his post at Boston University, Department of Film and Television, and Rashna from Rhodes College in Memphis, where she's the chair of media studies. And I'm really looking forward to today and to learning a lot. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to the two of them, and I will stick around and pop in from time to time when I get too curious to say silent. And all of you can do that as well, albeit via text. So feel free to use the chat function and or the Q&A function, and let us know any questions you might have or any comments you want to introduce, and we'll be fielding those throughout as well. We have an hour in toto, and I don't want to hold things up. So Bruno, I'm going to ask you to just give folks a sense of the book and provide our introduction.
Thank you, Ruby, and thanks, Rashna, for being here with us today and for writing and publishing this wonderful book. I have a copy here, Cinematic TV. I also wanted to just remind everybody that our page views column is always online and available for everyone. And it also includes the introduction to Rashna's book, written by herself. So in addition to my feature on the book as well in our interview. So this is sort of just an extension of the conversation we've had a few months ago in preparation for the publication of the issue. So I will just say a few words about the book so that everybody's more familiar with it. And then I'll have some questions for Rashna, and Ruby will jump in whenever. So the book is called Cinematic TV, Serial Drama Goes to the Movies. And I think that a fitting place to start is the same place where the book starts, which is discussing the very term that the title is using here. And Rashna explains in the book that there's no consensus about what the term cinematic TV actually means. And it actually often betrays a judgment of value in regards to television, as though it can only be considered of quality or worthy if it becomes cinematic. So Rashna, despite using the term on the title, wholeheartedly rejects that evaluative judgment that's often implied in that term, right? So she says that when serial drama goes to the movies, they reveal an archival impulse. This is for her what is cinematic in the book, right? The impulse on the part of TV series to treat cinema as an archive from which certain images are appropriated, negotiated, reinvented, as well as challenged. So the analysis that she partakes here is not one that's simply of detecting homages and references to cinema, but raising the question of what these appropriations mean for the television text, as well as for the cinematic text. In a strange way, I think whenever TV invites viewers to remember these cinematic moments, it is also demanding a revisit and sometimes even a revision of the cinematic texts to which it is referring. These cinematic references that pop up in television are not always alike, obviously, right? And Rashna helpfully divides the book into 4 chapters, each detailing a different modality of reference and each focusing on a specific TV show. So the 4 different modes that we'll spend some time talking about today are homage, evocation, genre, and parody. And the series are Stranger Things, Mad Men, Damages, and Dear White People, among other texts that she mentions in passing. But I think it's interesting. These 4 series got me really excited about the book because I have watched and loved 3 of them. So it was, I think it's also a very delicious book to read because it's not just addressing these televisual texts that were very dear to me, but also helping me figure out what the references that these texts are making could mean or actually mean. So the analytical framework of the book actually takes intertextuality as the key operating principle of television. So every text is always already an intertext, right? Directly and indirectly referring to previously existing texts. What I really like about this approach that she takes in the book is how it actually dismantles the autonomy of the author as the text's primary agent of signification and positions in his or her place the viewer as an active participant in the meaning making and interpretation, right? So it's in their ability to recognize the cinematic texts that are embedded in television that viewers become producers of meaning in their own right. And this is highlighted in the book's focus on TV's unprompted and inadvertent references to cinema, which are then recognized by a viewer with his or her own structures of knowledge. So that means that in many cases, it's not TV that's accessing cinema as an archive, but viewers themselves in their own search for references that they can recognize on their own. So again, displacing who the author of that text or of the way that the text is interpreted really is. And I think this leads to what is most impressive to me in Rashna's work, which is that if cinema serves as an archive for television, she herself must be prepared to recognize these references with an impressive arsenal of media texts in her own memory archive. So in that process, she demonstrates a very wide-ranging familiarity with the cinematic text, as well as with the televisual text, being able to pinpoint the films that may be called up in particular moments, the mode of intertextuality the TV series is performing, and to suggest how that may affect both the viewer's understanding of the TV and the cinematic text, right? So importantly, these echoes of cinema and TV invites us to pause and linger on these images, enacting what she calls in the book a productive remembering or forgetting of cinema. And I really like this idea that cinematic TV also asks us to forget cinema sometimes. So it can be both evoking particular moments, but also dismissing them. So to go back to the term cinematic TV, I also wanted to point out that Rashna's interpretation, which again is based on these 4 modes of intertextuality that we'll address, escapes the prescriptive impulses often associated with the term television, with the television and cinematic discourse. What she's able to do here is, in fact, to reconsider what the cinematic means while taking TV both seriously and on its own terms. So in the end, I think the book is both television and cinema studies, but it's also a good reminder of the power of the work of a scholar when that scholar embraces, as Rashna does, her own subjectivity and personal frames of reference as starting points for what is a very important and illuminating investigation. So I just wanted to close this with the same words that I use at the end of my introduction to the book in the page views column of this issue, which suggests that Rashna's main contribution lies precisely in a valuable effort to theorize the many ways in which TV may look, sound, and feel like, or even capitalize on cinema without ever wanting to become it. Again, so cinematic TV is not at all meant to suggest that that TV wants to become cinema, but quite to the contrary. I'm going to give you a chance to, Rashna, I'll give you a chance to correct anything that I might have misinterpreted. But I also want to start with the question, or give you the chance to answer the question, what is cinematic television and why does the term bear some value despite being commonly misused and or misunderstood?
Thank you, Bruno. And if you don't mind, I'm going to start by giving thanks. Ruby, thank you for making this happen and for the introduction.
Sure.
Behind the scenes, Christina Ree and Rebecca Prime have been instrumental in making us look good and sound good. And Bruno, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for your very generous and thoughtful reading of my book. I feel like I don't have anything to correct because in some ways you described the work that I was trying to do better than I could have at this moment. And so I really appreciate the ways in which you are thinking through the term itself, cinematic, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but also the ways in which TV responds to cinema differently in different moments, not just in terms of different series responding differently, but even in the last 2 decades, there has been a shift in the relationship between cinema and television. I kind of did worry about using the title cinematic TV because I didn't want the book to, at least the title, to sound like this is yet another contribution that says, oh, TV has become a lot more cinematic. But I felt like rethinking of the adjective and repositioning it as memory work instead of thinking about it in qualitative or evaluative terms, as you mentioned, might actually still be productive, right? So I was thinking about the idea of attaching cinematic to television as a way of saying cinema is in fact very much operating in relation to cinema, right? And I say this in the book as well. In some ways, TV as a medium has never had the luxury to not be operating in relation to cinema, given, temporally that cinema came before television, and that even before TV was invented, the idea that what would a new medium that people could watch at home, what would that look like? Already it was starting to be defined, at least in relation to the idea of what TV could be as, either as cinematic or maybe not as cinematic, right? As a carrier of live images and therefore not cinematic. And so in some ways, TV has not had the luxury of just defining itself as its own medium, different from cinema. But what I was thinking is that particularly in the post-network and maybe even the post-ish cable era, that there has been a kind of shift in terms of that relationship, and that ever since we moved away from primarily episodic television, particularly in relation to TV dramas, to what we might call serial drama, or what Jason Mittell calls complex TV, that there has been a kind of explicit relationship being established between TV and cinema. It's not that television or TV series are in any way suggesting we don't have anything to do with cinema, right? But my question was, is that merely a matter of, in the way that it has been described in the quality TV discourse, is that simply a matter of the grand scope, the visual style, the amount of money spent per episode, or is there something else? So that was my starting point for the title as well as the project itself.
Great. I'm glad that you mentioned you put focus on the last 2 decades of television, and I was actually curious, why is it that the book really addresses these 20 last years, even though it just so happens that the 4 shows that you're addressing are recent, right? Is there something that's particular that happens in television that allows complex TV to become associated with cinematic TV, for example?
So partly this is a function of narrative arcs, right? Partly this is a function of the distinction that we make generally between what used to be called episodic TV, and now with serial drama, we're talking about sort of longer narrative arcs, more complex storytelling, which it's not that that didn't exist, right? So I say briefly in the book that it can at least be traced as far back as the 1980s, but it also has in some ways roots within soap opera. So it's not that it started in the 21st century, but there is something I think we could agree about, the moment sort of starting maybe with The Sopranos and beyond, right? That there is something about TV dramas that is different from what has come before. And I was particularly intrigued by those. I think part of it is about sort of binging and the ability to sort of watch television, not from week to week, but sort of multiple episodes at a time, as a much longer narrative, as well as a much longer period of time that one might spend with a given series in terms of either a season or perhaps even an entire series. And so that's where I began. But this is not to say at all that some of the features that I'm discussing didn't exist before the 21st century.
Right. And I think you already touched on that, but beyond those shows that you address in the book, what do you think we can consider cinematic TV why is the serial drama such a key format for this term?
So I think that part of it was that I wanted to sort of contest the very idea of quality television, right? That it wasn't so much that it was the quality that was different about these particular dramas, but the fact that they were establishing a relatively new relationship with cinema, right? That they weren't trying to copy, which is sort of the assumption, I think, underlying quality TV, right? That they're trying to be like cinema. They're sort of looking up to this earlier medium and suggesting, well, this is an establishment of quality and value, and therefore we're going to try to become it, right? And there are several TV scholars who have taken, who have objected to that argument, right? The idea that somehow we're now calling television better than ordinary TV, right? So Michael Z. Newman and Ilana Levine talk about how that is only possible if we sort of, restrict our definition to a very, very specific and supposedly kind of extraordinary version of regular TV. And that's not what I wanted to do. I didn't want to sort of imply that all of television has changed. Of course, there are still, episodic series out there, but what I wanted to do was zoom in on drama so that I could sort of evaluate what that relationship with cinema has become.
But you think that other formats could also be cinematic or address cinema as an archive as well?
Right, it could be, or it could be that television can be many things all at once, right? So, I mean, the broadcasting of sports has not gone away. It's not necessarily something that we would consider cinematic in the ways that we're talking about, but that hasn't gone away. Is that not TV? Is news not TV, right? So just calling TV, broadly speaking, cinematic only thinks about drama. So I was going to suggest with the title and with the book as a whole, that my focus is actually on the drama, and it's the dramas that have become more cinematic.
Right. The other thing I think that you use very well is the concept of intertextuality, right? To allow you to navigate between this, and I think intermediality, to navigate between these two media. Can you tell us a little bit about why intertextuality was important for you to address TV as well as cinematic TV in particular?
So part of this is the way my mind works. I mean, I quote from Godard's In Praise of Love, and I talk about sort of, you can only understand one thing by thinking about another thing. And it's sort of like, that's just the way, and it's not just with TV, right? I'm always thinking associatively. So this is sort of analogous to something else, or reminds me of something else, or something that, has come before. And so intertextuality became for me a way of thinking about the relationship that wasn't rooted in judgment of value. And it also, and you said this in your introduction beautifully, Bruno, that it helped me get away from the idea of assigning all of the authority to an author. And that was one of the things that started bothering me about whatever this new version of TV, particularly TV drama, is that we took very old models of the auteur and then kind of recast them as, the television showrunner. And I didn't like that idea, because I was thinking that TV was just so much more complex than sort of naming, and, as is often the case, naming yet, 5 more white men and saying, look at all these, great TV dramas that are being produced. And I wanted to sort of in some ways undermine that argument that somehow these TV shows were the products of these, great television auteurs, and instead think about analyzing TV series in a way that does justice to TV as a medium, and yet also allows me to talk about its connections and associations with cinema.
I think you do that particularly well. I think it's the second chapter, which is on Mad Men. So, why don't we take this opportunity to talk a little bit about how Mad Men sort of guided your work here, what it was supposed to be, and how it turned into the final format of the book, as well as what you're doing with Mad Men, which is precisely, I guess, dismissing the idea that Matthew Weiner is the person who is dictating all these references.
Exactly. So I say in my acknowledgments that the book that I wrote is not the book that I set out to write. Mad Men started everything for me in terms of this relationship, but it was really the very first episode of the series. When I finished the very first episode of the series, and, so it's Don Draper in the workplace, Don Draper with Midge, who turns out to be not just his girlfriend, but his mistress, and then Don Draper at the end of the very long day coming home to the suburbs. And we hadn't known in that first episode up until the very last few moments that he's, yet another man in a gray flannel suit. He's a married man. He lives in the suburbs. He has a wife and 2 children. We learned that at the end of the episode. And not just that, but the moments in the way that the first episode shows Draper returning home were, for me, very evocative of the first section of Hitchcock's The Wrong Man, in the way that Manny, a jazz player, returns home to his wife, and he's seemingly suspicious because he's returning home at like 3 or 4 in the morning, and then he becomes a family man. And I saw that and I said, holy shit, that's The Wrong Man, right? And then I started sort of, thinking about it further. And of course, I saw more overt Hitchcockian references. And then I wanted to talk more about it. And I realized that people weren't talking about that Hitchcock film, but they were talking about North by Northwest. And I started to ask myself, why is it that there is more emphasis on Don Draper as Roger or Thornhill, right? Makes sense. Advertising executive, etc. The location in New York City in the way that Don Draper is located. But I thought, well, why not Manny? And I started thinking about it, and I realized that North by Northwest in some ways is not just overtly invoked, right, by the series, but Matthew Weiner talks about it, right, that North by Northwest is one of the touchstones, that it was one of the films that he asked his crew to watch so that they could visualize what this time period would look like. So that's when I started thinking, how is it possible to write about Mad Men, which is replete, right, as we know, with references to films from the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. Is there another way to write about this series, and a way to write about the films that the series, for me, evokes that may not necessarily be referred to? They may be connections. I mean, I'm not reading, Matthew Weiner's mind, and I haven't had any conversations with him, so I have no idea. But that's exactly the point of the chapter, is that we don't necessarily need to consult the oracle, right? We don't need to go to him and say, what were you thinking about? Can you please tell us? But instead, are there other types of films? And for me, what was really interesting is not just films by, directors from the period that we remember, but the forgotten films, the forgotten directors, right? The forgotten moments from those times that somehow just kind of, keep haunting the images in the series. And that's what I really wanted to explore. So that's how evocation becomes the guiding principle for that particular chapter.
Can I jump in for a second, Bruno? So if I can just take what you said to the extreme, Rashna, it may be that the ideal television viewer of this new TV should be a film scholar.
That would be great, right? Especially in this way. I think that, and Bruno, you were saying this earlier, that part of it is it the TV is using cinema as an archive, or is it the TV spectator who is using cinema as an archive? And, and that's not a hard and fast line here between those two ideas, right? So it is, in fact, you're right, Ruby, that it is a particular form of spectatorship to have viewed and have that memory to be able to draw on for any given spectator. And for me, what's cool about that is that the Mad Men chapter could be written by another, film or TV scholar and be, talking about a whole series of films that I may not have noticed. And that's what I find really promising and generative about working in this way, is that there are so many different avenues to pursue instead of the ones that have been sort of known as references or allusions in that particular series.
Yeah, I think this is what I try to refer to when I mention the subjectivity of the scholar, and I think you're foregrounding that very well, right? Suggesting that this is your own reading, and there are many possible readings, both on the part of viewers as well as on the part of other scholars. And I also wonder what happens to viewers who don't have that cinematic archive, right? Or don't have the canonical cinematic archives, right? And then they start seeing references from other national cinemas that are not the standard American or from world film history, that could actually, as you suggest throughout the book, it re-illuminates the TV text as well, right? By gaining this global perspective, potentially global perspective or alternative perspective that's not intended by the author.
Right. And so my thinking here was, and I think that's absolutely right, that, there is a whole other archive that, I'm primarily focusing on American cinema, and frankly, primarily on popular American cinema throughout the book, although I do refer to some European films as well. But it is true that the archive that the spectator brings to any given TV text, right, will determine which direction they take, and therefore will illuminate new parts of that series. Because the purpose of doing this kind of work is not to say, okay, what does this particular scene mean, but what might it mean if we put it in conversation with another text? And that text could be from American cinema, but it could be from any part of the globe, really.
Yeah. So this is something that I've been curious about since I started reading a book. What kind of work, what kind of labor, or rather, how do you prepare to watch these TV shows, right? With the book in mind or with the research project in mind, how do you select what to watch? And then how do you find these references? Is it like the Mad Men anecdote that you told us, that it just occurred to you because you already had that experience? Or is there some sort of prep work, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, thank you for asking, because if I don't want it to sound like, and then I watch it and everything just comes to me and then the connections happen and how fun. And sometimes that does happen, and it's the Wrong Man is that example, right, where it just kind of happens. But what I also did, and so my writing process itself is fairly nonlinear, so I'll watch and then I'll watch some films at the time. And some of the work that I did for the Mad Men chapter, or even for the Stranger Things chapter, I watched a lot more films from the period, especially things that I had not initially seen. But sometimes it was sort of like, as I was watching the film that had been made several decades, obviously, before the TV series was made. So in some ways, I've watched the TV series. I'm going back to, say, 60s cinema. I'm watching a film that was made decades earlier, but now I'm sort of backtracking and saying, oh, I think I see a connection here. This is what happened with James Ivory's Savages. I heard of the film, but never watched it. And so I said, well, so as I was thinking about films from that era, I watched it. Also, Doris Wishman's Bad Girls Go to Hell. Is that the title? Yes. And that was not a film I was familiar with. And since then, of course, I've not only watched it, but I have taught the film, because it is so incredible in terms of understanding that particular moment in American cultural history, but also in American film history. And it wasn't a film that came to me as I was watching that particular moment, but I watched it and I thought, well, clearly this is a film that has a connection with the series. And as I was doing that chapter, as well as the first one, it became clear how many films, because that period is replete with those particular types of visual images, that how many of those can be found if we go looking in that direction.
That was, I'm going to piggyback on your question, Bruno, because I had very similar thoughts, which namely, why are these your objects? How did you come up with these particular objects on which to focus? And especially something perhaps like Dear White People, which complicates things, since it was a film originally of its own, not just other people's. So I'm curious how these are your objects, and whether there were others that you picked up but then set down and abandoned. I'm curious how you settled on these.
So part of it was sort of trying to figure out that I didn't want to do multiple readings in any given chapter without having a kind of through line or a kind of cohesive kind of organizing principle, right? So for each of these chapters, as I was picking the modality that would work. So for Stranger Things, it felt like, even though there is already a lot of work being done on Stranger Things and homage, particularly homage to the 1980s, I wanted to use that term to say, okay, so but how exactly is homage working, right? those, especially the ones that are from the 1980s, right? Those were kind of more obvious in terms of, the Spielberg references, the Stephen King references. Those were the more obvious ones. And those kind of came to me because I was familiar with that period. The Mad Men chapter, some of those I went back to and sort of found, in some ways, it's almost sort of, not so much, in a different way. This is my way of sort of going back and saying, this is found footage because I found it after the fact. Not that it is, but, I went back to the era only because I wanted to see what else was the sort of popular conversation missing from that particular time. The third chapter on damages is much more straightforward because I was working with genre. And so I was, especially the last bit of that chapter on the maternal melodrama, I was very familiar with those films. And so as I was watching Damages for the very first time, I'm like, I know I want to write on this and I know where I want to go with it. And so that was much easier. The Dear White People chapter, in some ways, was the hardest partly because there was so much that I wanted to say about that particular series. And I have to say, the fourth season is out. And so please, I have not watched it. And so if you've already binged on season 4, I will actually plug my ears. That's my weekend plan. But for that, it was almost as though I was trying to figure out popular culture itself, because in some ways what I argue in the fourth chapter is that Dear White People isn't trying to even be cinematic in the ways that I've been talking about with that particular term, right? So it is trying to in some ways say it is not cinematic, and yet trying to place a TV series in the place of what we might consider to be in many cases high art, right? So what does it mean to put TV in the place of cinema and then to displace the authority of cinema? And so that's how I was thinking about that particular chapter, although the immediate or the particular references came to me as I was watching the series.
In a different way than Stranger Things.
Right, exactly.
Let's talk more about Dear White People. I think that's my favorite chapter. And I don't know if it's because I really like the series or because your reading of the series was quite revealing. Even in the ways to explain why I might like the series that I had not noticed before. So you suggest that the series operates on parody mostly, right? So how does it sort of reveal whiteness as a cinematic convention at the same time as you say that it is rejecting the idea of the cinematic, right? Or trying to sustain television as its own the very powers of television itself.
Yeah. So Dear White People was interesting. For one thing, I didn't know if I could use that series, given that it's not your conventional drama, right? In fact, it's not even known necessarily as a drama, but at best a dramedy. So I was like, is that even something I can include in a book that has drama in its title? And then, of course, I went for it because I felt like the dramatic elements outweigh in some ways some of the comedic elements in the film, or that the comedic elements are parody and therefore are far larger than something that's actually kind of a sitcom. So that's how I justified it. Sorry, could you go back to the second part of your question?
Which was about how it reveals the whiteness as a cinematic convention, right? So, and I think that's what it's trying to do with its parody, or that's what you're highlighting.
Exactly. So one of the ways in which I thought of framing the Dear White People chapter is to say, are there any TV series that are not doing what I say TV series are doing, right? So I had said up until that point that TV series are either explicitly or implicitly drawing upon the cinematic archive, and that's what makes them cinematic. Are there TV series that are not doing that, or doing that but in a very different way or for a very different effect? And that's where Dear White People comes in, because I don't feel like Dear White People is suggesting this is so similar to this film you have seen before in ways that Stranger Things, Mad Men, and Damages are, right? So for example, in Stranger Things, yes, there is this element of sort of distancing oneself from the object of love in the case of Homage with Stranger Things, right? But the distancing only works because the adoration for the object of love almost precedes that kind of distancing, right? Whereas in some ways, Dear White People is foregrounding the distancing or foregrounding the difference, right? And suggesting it can't be Dear White People about Black students at a predominantly white institution are not going to really resemble in any way white students or white characters in earlier films. And so what does it mean to foreground that? What does it mean to say, we are drawing on something that has come before, drawing on the archive, and most of the films that I write about in that chapter are fairly well-known and popular, right? So what does it mean to draw on images, moments like from the ending of Cabiria, and putting Sam White in that position and making her that character in that moment? What does it mean to put her in that space? And although the moments are similar, no one's going to mistake one for the other, right? And so the question that I was asking is, can TV in some ways try to not become cinematic, but use the conventions of cinematicity to draw attention to, in this case, the whiteness of those conventions, right? That perhaps in the other chapters we're not as aware of because we're not necessarily seeing difference, right? Like if, to go back to the Wrong Man example, Don Draper, in fact, very much looks like Manny Balistrero, right? Like there are differences, of course, but they are very similar. So there isn't that kind of critical distancing work that is being done, say, when we talk about Coco Connors and Elle Woods in Dear White People.
Gosh, I was going to say something in response to, so it's almost like we don't have such a wide range of cinematic references for these characters in this particular situation, right? I thought a lot about Spike Lee, and I think Spike Lee, does he direct one of the episodes in the first season, if I'm not mistaken, or no? But there are some, right? There are some more references like that that I think these associations are more like homage, right, or even evocations. But in the way that it is utilizing these conventions, it sort of highlights what cinema is missing or has been missing.
Right. And in some ways, Dear White People sort of coming later, even in the very brief history of serial drama, right, complex TV. I mean, it's sort of, say, 20, 30 years old. And Dear White People comes, so Dear White People in some ways is, yes, referring to a lot of films, but it's also sort of doing critical work in drawing attention to and foregrounding the whiteness of the tradition also with earlier TV series, right? So it's suggesting that the TV series are sort of doing the work of blending TV with cinema in ways that Dear White People just can't or won't.
Bruno, I'm going to start bringing in some of the one of the questions that came up that I think is really useful to bring in at this point, if that's okay.
Of course, yeah.
Lisa Parks is thanking you, Dr. Richards, for your scholarship, and it has a really interesting question. What is the relationship between the technological and cinematic TV? And she says, it seems that when there are certain technological changes, like the emergence of color, the production of DVD sets, now the streaming platforms, then the references to TV as either quality or cinematic tend to flourish. And she says she's thinking also of Barbara Klinger's book, Beyond the Multiplex here. And are there certain kinds of technological affordances in TV production, distribution, and exhibition that seem to make TV more cinematic? So what do you think about that in terms of the technological effects?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa, for that question and for coming. I think that is definitely one of the keys, and in some ways we wouldn't be talking about cinematic TV without the kinds of technological changes that have occurred in the TV industry within the last 30 or 40 years, right? So part of the distinction between TV and cinema for the first 30 years of the TV medium, right, was not necessarily just the difference in terms of, the kind of more complex characters in cinema, or, the more sort of the shorter episodic treatments of stories in TV, but also that TV looked visually different from cinema, right? That it was not just that it was on a smaller screen, but that, there were glitches. And for a while, yes, it was, initially it was black and white. And so the differences between the two media were very easy to draw. Over time, it's the technological and I would say the economic changes that have occurred in the industry that make it possible for TV episodes to look more visually similar, right, in the ways that cinematic or films do, that has made it possible for us to even make that comparison. So it's not even about content so much as what is possible now in this medium that didn't used to be possible before. And absolutely, I think that those changes initially led to declarations of TV as having become quality TV.
And I think that goes along with the production side of it as well as the exhibition side of it, right? With TV sets becoming better and wider as well.
Right.
And it was also along those lines, I was wondering, this is also, I think, technological and economic development, which is the appearance of streaming services, right? And 2 of the 4 series to focus on are Netflix production and or content. What does this say about quality television and being able to target particularly niche audiences? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? And is it useful to talk about television when you have network, cable, and streaming being such different beasts?
Right. And for a time I thought, when I started thinking, okay, so I should expand beyond Mad Men. And I thought, I wonder if I should focus on, say, AMC, which in some ways sort of started this whole, or at least was at the forefront of the trend of sort of, whatever we're calling, cinematic or at least quality TV. And I wondered if that would be productive. And then, of course, I wanted to write about Stranger Things as well and Dear White People as well. And so I thought, well, that's not possible. But I do think that being able to create texts that don't have to necessarily appeal to as wide an audience as, say, certainly the broadcasting networks, made possible. So in the same way that we think about sort of film history, right, the distinction that we make, say, in the late 1950s, right, with the breakdown of the production code and with the ability for films to just be able to, appeal to smaller audiences rather than, very wide audiences, that in fact made it possible for films to focus on themes that earlier they might not have. For one thing, they might not have gotten, the certificate of approval, but also that they might not have actually appealed to a very wide audience. And I do think that what, post-cable and satellite and then certainly streaming platforms make possible is the idea that TV shows can also, unlike what we thought of television as sort of like, basically broadcasting to everybody, that TV shows too can cultivate smaller audiences and actually thrive because of it, instead of trying to appeal to 20, 30, 50 million people. And I do think that what streaming particularly makes possible, in the sense that one can release the entirety of a season, right, at once, makes it possible for us to sort of think about TV differently, right? Just the availability of all of those episodes makes sort of our spectatorial notions of what TV has become. At least we can investigate that question differently.
Yeah, I also think when Stranger Things came out, I always wondered that, or it felt like it was a show whose concept had come out of an algorithm, right? That it was a mashup of the best hits of popular TV shows at the time, but then created this. And I think, to talk about the intertextuality of Stranger Things and which text it is referencing that's quite a rich text to do that with. So.
No, absolutely. So I have to make a confession here with Stranger Things in particular. So my husband, who actually watches more TV than I do, I think, said we should watch Stranger Things. And, I had heard about it, read about it, and I said, no way, no how. There is no chance that, like I was thinking the way you were just talking about it, like it sounds like an algorithm, right? It sounds like a mashup of things I do not care to watch. And I watched one episode and I'm like, it is in fact drawing on not just the 80s, but as I read about sort of the Shadow Monster is this kind of, a series of allusions to all kinds of monsters from all parts of the American horror canon. And at the same time, it's doing more than that, right? It's not restricting itself to just a series of references. I was worried that it was just going to be a whole bunch of Easter eggs, like, did you catch this? Did you catch that? But that it does have a lot of productive value because it feels like it's doing more than simply saying, look how cool we can be by making all of these references, or that once we can look at all of them together in a spot, like that's why I kind of think of it as a kind of a kind of a televisual Frankenstein show, right? Because it is a kind of, it's sort of like almost too much. It's like, really, you could refer to every single thing. But then at the same time, I think that is precisely where I found it most valuable, to think about what TV can do with cinema, to try to sort of, I call it a kind of a televisual devouring, right? That it's almost sort of consuming all of it and then kind of regurgitating it, but regurgitating it in a way that actually asks us to sort of distance ourselves and say, it's not so simple as the alien coming out of the sky, but there is some, that because of all of the varied references, it becomes a lot more, a lot richer.
There's another great question here I want to bring in. This one is from Kartik Nair, saying, congratulations on this exciting book, Dr. Richards, look forward to reading it. And then he says that the more he listened to you and Bruno go back and forth about watching Mad Men and what you saw in it, it occurs to him to wonder if the archive in question is actually you, the viewer, and that the show seems to ping something in your residual memories. And that in that moment may be experienced as a reference. And is it just a way to extend the intertextual question, perhaps the presence of text within us, that we are unactivated archival collections ourselves? So I guess, Kartik, you're saying, who is the Frankenstein here?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Kartik, for asking. I think that is in some ways, and Bruno, you said this in your introduction too, there is on the one hand a distinction to be made between the text that already exist, or the hypertext that exists within any given TV series, and the ones that we bring to that particular TV series as viewers, right? But I'm not sure where we draw that line. Is it there because I see it, or is it actually there in the sense that would another viewer see it too? And I think it partly depends, right? So of course, as we said earlier with Stranger Things, a lot more viewers will see the references, so to speak, because in some ways, as homage, those are intended, if you will, and those are, explicit. But then the question does become, what is the critical role that a spectator can play in any given TV series, given our own memories, right? So I rely on Alaida Osman's understanding of the difference between, active and passive forgetting and active and passive memory. And I like the concept of passive memory so much. I like the idea of the distinction that she also makes between the canon and the archive, right? The canon is the thing that we want to remember, right? These are things that we kind of want to register as references. But then she calls the archive, like in at a museum, this is stuff that is at the museum, but it may be in the basement. It's not the stuff that is on display, right? So all of our memories that are not quote unquote on display, but they are sitting there somewhere, and they become activated because of a connection or an association in any given TV text. I think that for me, that's the most fascinating part of, working on this kind of a project.
And in addition to that, right, the way that you highlight these as being, or as Kartik puts it, like the archive being in the viewer as well, just suggests that more important than pointing out what these references are is really unpacking what they're doing, right, and what they're revealing about the text. And that revelation can be both on the text that refers to, or the text that is doing the reference, right?
Right. No, and this is sort of my main issue, if you will, whenever sort of I'm trying to read about a particular TV series, and there's a lot of intelligent criticism, right? But a lot of the popular criticism online is about cataloging. It's about listing. It's about sort of like, did you notice? And then there are like the top 20 references in, or, or my other kind of problem, which is that the mix mix-up of like the word homage and reference and allusion, as if they all mean the same thing. And I think that that in some ways is in popular discourse, that is how people think about the idea of reference, and also in some ways the idea of intermediality, right? That the relationship is that it's drawing on something that came before it. And so what I wanted to do is figure out, okay, so making that association overt, right, for a particular viewer, can we do something with that? And can we actually use it to then analyze both the TV text in front of us, but also go back and rethink the cinematic text? And that in part is why I sort of insist that I don't want to sort of think of that cinematic text as an original, because the cinematic text is also a series of things that came before it and so on, right? So can we in fact use these connections or associations in more productive ways? That has been, by sort of the primary thing that I've tried to do here.
My internet got a little spotty.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I was following, and then all of a sudden everybody stopped. Ruby, you had mentioned something about how the pandemic has changed our relationship to television that you wanted to address.
I'm really wondering. Yeah, I mean, you've referenced this a bit going through, but I wonder to what extent streaming has changed the way you see your whole subject area, and how the pandemic and the explosion of binge watching, which we have actually a special focus in this current issue on, how has that changed the terms of the field, or is that an expected development? Is it a momentary detour? How do you see this current moment in terms of your study?
That's a really good question, Ruby. And I'm not entirely sure that I wish that we were in truly in a post-COVID moment where we could be reflecting on COVID and be like, yeah, what was that all about?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
We could be there. But I feel like because of streaming, and then, the pandemic may have exacerbated that which was already occurring for the last few years, the idea that one can actually think about watching both on one's own terms, the playback option. So then going back and forth and not just watching in a kind of linear fashion, or picking which episode one watches and not necessarily in the linear order that has been established for any given series or season. All of those things I do think are changing what we might have typically considered, sort of at least going back to cinema itself and cinema in the movie theater, certainly that idea of sort of that 90-minute chunk of time, that has changed, and the ability to go back and rewatch. Part of what I am thinking about for my next project is this notion of rewatching, and I'm really fascinated by that, especially in relation to streaming, or even just like going back and watching videos on, say, YouTube, or even now on TikTok, right? What does it mean to return? Are we returning as the same selves? Are we returning as new people? And I would love to sort of think about, like I said, when we actually get to post-COVID, what is it that we watch when we watch again, especially? What is it that we see in a series that we didn't see the first time around, or in a film the first time around? But I do think that there has been a shift in terms of how we are experiencing moving image media.
Interesting. And I have a very sort of nerdy question, which is, what do you watch on? Because I find that with all the talk about streaming, no one ever really discloses what they're watching on. And there is this assumption with a Criterion putting out these beautiful issues and all this kind of thing. Fine, you've restored it, you've perfectly packaged it. But what on earth are people looking at it on? Are they looking at it on their iPad in a corner of the bedroom? Or are they looking at it on a Panasonic HZ2000? What do you watch on, and what do you think people watch on? I can't resist. I know it's a silly question.
No, I think it's perfect. Not the Panasonic HZ2000. I don't quite have that, but we as do most people, we have a widescreen TV, and so most of my viewing happens there. Although a lot of so this is interesting, going back to the previous question, and I hadn't thought about it until you just mentioned it. Most of my rewatching happens on my laptop. because then I can sit with it
Yeah.
and it's just me and, you know, my books
Mhm.
and my laptop. And so I do think that there is a different experience there, but it's also more immediate, right? Because I can lean in and I can pause and I can rewind. And there is this kind of, you know, physical kind of attachment and relationship with whatever text I'm working with that happens with on my laptop. I haven't quite, I think I'm too old for watching anything, you know, for a long period of time on my phone, or maybe I have resisted and haven't gotten that far, but maybe I'll just have to give in and do that.
Really good. Really good. Any last comment or question, Bruno? I kind of took over the finale
No.
there.
No, I mean, along that question, I think there's also the question of the collective viewing, right? So it just so happens that these I mean, I don't watch TV shows on my own. I kind of like to share that with someone, right? And that also affects how I experience them. So if you don't mind, right, what's the difference? Did you watch any of these shows sort of like with the scholarship in mind, in a individual setting, or was it always sort of like a shared experience as well?
So I think, I'm trying to think, I think all four of the main shows that I'm writing about were all initially watched, you know, with my family. And so it was sort of, you know, my husband, who's a literature professor, and so we're sort of like our entire lives are about sort of talking about texts, and our 7.5-year-old who watches not every single thing, because she, you know, she doesn't have the bandwidth for everything we watch, but most things that we watch, and certainly many of the shows that I write about in the book, she has watched with me and with us. And so I think that watching it together, and especially with my husband, for sort of being able to talk and pause and talk, pause and talk. And that's kind of like my first go through with a text. And then the next time and the subsequent viewings are always, like I said, me and my laptop.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. This has been such a terrific conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Richards. And for everyone else, take a look at what's available online, both Bruno's conversation with Rashna, but also the chapter, the introduction. And if you look at the filmquarterly.org website, Mark has just posted a link. You'll see that in the page view section, there's a kind of virtual library of all of the books that we've spotlighted over these past years, and downloadable chapters from each of them. And also in the video section, you'll be able to find the past years webinars and conversations. And if you have suggestions for us, if you have books coming out yourselves, be in touch, because we love doing this. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you.
Rashna.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.